In this episode, we're talking about how to plan for the future of your family cabin.
Thanks everyone who's tuning into this episode. Today we are talking about cabins. Summer's coming to an end.
Well, a good time to talk about it because everybody's fresh from the cabin season, and you've probably been spending a lot of time there with your kids if you have a cabin, and so you want to make sure that that cabin's protected.
Yeah, and that's really what this episode's about. You know, so many Manitoban families have cabins within their family that everyone gets to enjoy and spend a ton of time at throughout the summer. And many people that maybe haven't done some of this planning around their cabin have no idea what could potentially happen if something were to happen to them.
Yeah, I mean, to put in perspective, without planning, you are potentially looking, it depends where your cabin is, but you're potentially looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs in order to transfer a cabin over. So you really want to make sure, this is a big part of planning, estate planning for any cabin owners out there.
So with regards to planning, where do you start, Grant?
Yeah, this is a good question because a lot of people I really don't have a good idea as to what to do, where to start. And I would always suggest that the first place to start is that you need to understand who exactly the cabin is important to in your family. And this involves having a discussion around it. I mean, you can assume that you know who it's important to, but frankly, I wouldn't leave it up to that because you just don't know. I mean, there's been lots of situations. Thankfully, we encourage all of our clients to have this conversation, but I've come across new clients where we haven't been working with them before, and there's been issues related to this where the parents assumed that one child wanted the cabin and then assumed the other one didn't, and then there became issues later on. Luckily, they were still alive in this case, and they were able to sort it out. But in any case, if you die and you haven't sorted that out, there's no way to fix it after you're gone. So I really encourage you to have a family meeting, or at least the one-on-one discussions with each kid, and discuss how important that property is to them. And just really have a good understanding. And I would say that this goes beyond cabins. This goes for any large asset, but in particular cabins, because it might be a potentially extremely large asset that is extremely emotionally charged for people because they've spent summers growing up there as kids.
And all those memories.
All the memories and all of that. And so you really want to make sure you just truly understand who exactly it's important to. You might be surprised. It might not be important to somebody, and then in which case that leads you down another path of planning. But until you know that, there's no point in going on. You have to know that first, and then you can take the next steps.
So one of the most common mistakes that we see with cabin succession planning is failing to plan for the capital gains tax on the property. Speak a little bit to this point.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the financial consequence of not planning for the cabin succession, is because what the capital gain is going to be is essentially if you take what you paid for the property in the first place, and then what it's eventually either sold for or what the deemed disposition is at the time of your death or the last of the two spouses dies. That's essentially the capital gain. So let's say you paid $100,000 for a cabin, you bought it 20 years ago in Lake of the Woods, and now that same property is worth $1 million. Okay, the capital gain between the two, $1 million minus $100,000, is $900,000. Okay, of which, you know, in Canada, 50% only of that gain is taxable. So you're looking at a $450,000 taxable event. Okay, of which, you know, throw that at your income tax level on your estate, and that's going to be roughly, let's call it 50%. So you're looking at $225,000 being paid to CRA as tax on that, in that example. So where the issue lies is, let's say your estate doesn't have $225,000 of liquid cash available to pay for that liability. Well, the estate will need to sell off assets in order to pay that bill, or unless your beneficiaries have $225,000, in which they can obviously do that as well. But again, therein lies the problem, is if they don't have that liquid cash available and your estate doesn't, assets will need to be sold by the estate to pay for the bill.
Which could mean your family cabin that you love so much and have all these amazing memories at will need to be sold.
Exactly. So this goes beyond planning on the emotional side of the cabin and who the cabin should go to. This is the one that's really important in making sure that you can actually keep it in your family altogether. So if you don't have the resources available to pay for it, then there's some other planning that's going to be required in there. And then typically that's done through life insurance, is usually the cheapest way of doing that. So if you have a good financial plan, it'll project forward the value of the cabin into the future, and, you know, based on a reasonable time of death, you know, we don't know for sure, but and then we'll be able to put into place a life insurance policy that would cover the potential tax liability down the road. And even, that versus using liquid cash is often the cheapest way of paying for that tax liability. So it's a good idea to at least look at that option. Some people can't get insurance depending on age, depending on health, but it's always a good idea to look at it because it can save you a lot of money while you're, for your heirs essentially, and just hand over more assets to your kids rather than CRA.
So something else to consider in cabin succession planning, and we've touched on this a little bit, but what about if not all of the children necessarily want the cabin and you may be leaving it to only one child?
Yeah. And actually, that's kind of a common occurrence. As many families are finding out, it's actually difficult to own cabins with multiple partners because there's issues that come up with it. I mean, when it needs a new roof, are all of the owners of the cabin on equal financial, sitting? Basically, can they all afford to contribute as much to the maintenance as everybody else can?
Cabin toys,
You name
boats,
it.
sea-doos.
Anybody with a cabin knows it can be a pricey thing to own, and so you need to make sure that the beneficiaries who eventually own it can actually afford to own it as well, or does it cause problems down the road? So anyway, long story short is, it's important to have that conversation. It's important for you to evaluate your heir's ability to own the cabin. And then what you may want to look at is if, let's say, either one beneficiary doesn't want the cabin as much as the other one does, then you can look at estate equalization strategies. And so essentially what that is if one kid wants to own the cabin that's worth $1 million, and the other kid doesn't want to own the cabin, but you also have $1 million of either life insurance proceeds or you've got $1 million portfolio that you're planning to leave to your estate, well, you can give one kid the cabin for $1 million, and you can give the other kid the cash for $1 million, and they're equalized out. Okay, now that's a pretty simple example, but there's lots of different ways of equalizing out your heirs and making sure that everybody's whole. But I would really stress that you want to talk to them about this before, because you might find out that something you didn't think was important to somebody is really important to the other one. Don't assume because one of your kids doesn't go to the cabin very often that they're not interested in owning a part of it or all of it later on. It may just not be a priority for them today. And so you really want to have that conversation with them. And you probably want to have that conversation a number of times throughout the remainder of your life. Hopefully it's a long time, but through the remainder of your life to adjust things. So it's important to have the conversation, but from there are lots of equalization strategies to make sure that the kids are made whole if you want to make them whole.
Well, with that's it for today's episode. We actually have written a blog piece on cabin succession planning that we will include in the link below or in the description below. It goes into detail on some other ways to deal with some of these problems through personal trust.
There's a lot of details that go into this, and so we've elaborated a little bit more in the written piece. But certainly, I think if there are questions about it, this is a completely customized plan, and that needs to be done for everybody. So you just get in touch with us, and we're happy to answer any questions you have.
So with that, I guess we will close it off. Check us out at www.whitehoustonwealth.com. Email whitehoustonwealth@nbc.ca. We're happy to answer any questions and hear from you, any feedback. So always welcome. With that, let's close it off.
Ready?
Aim.
Fire.